Introduction: the twilight of a golden age. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's journey through one of history's most compelling and mysterious royal endings. Before we begin, I want you to settle in comfortably, perhaps dim the lights. Let the soft hum of a fan create that perfect background atmosphere, and prepare yourself for a story that has captivated historians for over 4 centuries. Tonight, we delve into the final days of Queen Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, and arguably one of England's most iconic rulers. She was a woman who led her country through an unprecedented age of flourishing art, decisive military victories, and the forging of what would become a global empire. But behind the crown, behind the power, behind the carefully constructed image of the Virgin Queen, was a human being whose death remains one of history's most enigmatic royal endings. Take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying the content, and subscribe if you genuinely find value in these deep dives into history. I'm always curious to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below, and let's see how far our historical community reaches tonight. Now, let's step back in time to the winter of 1602, when the greatest queen in English history was facing her greatest enemy. Not foreign invasion, not court intrigue, not even the machinations of ambitious nobles, but time itself. Chapter 1. The Weight of Decades. The autumn of a rainbow. The winter of 1602. Queen Elizabeth I was approaching her 70th year, an age that few reached in Tudor England, where life expectancy hovered around 40 years for commoners and perhaps 50 for the nobility. For a woman to reach such an advanced age, while maintaining the grueling demands of absolute monarchy, was nothing short of extraordinary. Yet the toll of nearly half a century of rule was beginning to show in ways both subtle and profound. Her skin, once powdered into porcelain perfection, that had dazzled courtiers and foreign ambassadors alike, had begun to betray the fragility beneath. The famous white lead cosmetics that had given her that otherworldly deliberate construction of divine monarchy could no longer fully mask the lines that mapped decades of political stress, personal sacrifice, and the weight of a crown that had demanded everything of her. Her brilliant auburn wigs, once symbols of youthful power and carefully maintained royal iconography, now sat atop a body that had been weathered by 44 years of solitary rule. These were not mere accessories but vital components of her public persona, each curl and jewel positioned to project strength, vitality, and the divine right to rule. Now, they seemed almost to mock the reality beneath a woman whose mortal frame could no longer sustain the mythical image she had so carefully constructed. For 44 years, she had reigned alone. Consider the magnitude of this achievement. She had outlived rivals who had once seemed insurmountable, buried suitors who had sought to claim her throne through marriage, and silenced every threat that had risen against her reign. Mary, Queen of Scots, who had haunted her for decades with claims to the English throne, had been executed in 1587. The Spanish Armada, that seemingly invincible fleet that had threatened to restore Catholic rule to England, had been scattered by storms and English naval prowess in 1588. The various Catholic plots, the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot, all had been uncovered and their conspirators brought to justice. But now, the iron will that had defined the Queen and had become synonymous with English strength itself was beginning to crack. Though her mind remained sharp, that brilliant intellect that could debate theology with bishops, discuss statecraft with ambassadors, and compose poetry that would endure for centuries, those closest to her noticed something fundamental was shifting. The subtle signs of decline. Her appetite, once hearty and befitting a woman who had weathered the storms of statecraft, had begun to wane. Courtiers noted that she picked at her food during formal meals, leaving elaborate dishes untouched. The royal cooks, who had long prided themselves on creating culinary masterpieces for their sovereign, found their efforts increasingly dismissed. This was particularly troubling because Elizabeth had always been known for her appreciation of good food and her ability to use dining as a form of diplomatic theatre. Her presence at court, once commanding and regular, had grown sporadic. The woman who had made it her business to know every detail of court life, who had maintained strict protocols about when and how she could be approached, who had used her very visibility as a tool of statecraft, was now increasingly absent from the daily machinery of governance. Courtiers would arrive for scheduled audiences only to be told that Her Majesty was indisposed. The fire that had once radiated from her throne at Whitehall, that palpable sense of energy and authority that had made even the most powerful nobles tremble seemed dimmed. Foreign ambassadors, accustomed to the Queen's sharp wit and formidable presence, found themselves dealing increasingly with her ministers. The theatrical aspects of monarchy, which Elizabeth had elevated to an art form, were gradually being abandoned. The whispers begin with the turning of the year, as 1602 became 1603. Rumors began to whisper through the tapestried halls of Richmond Palace. The palace itself, built by Elizabeth's grandfather Henry VII, had always been one of her favorite residences. Its location on the Thames, its magnificent gardens, and its relative privacy from the bustle of London made it an ideal retreat for a monarch who needed to balance public duty with private reflection. But now, the palace that had once echoed with music, laughter, and the animated discussions of the most brilliant minds in Europe had taken on a different character. The rumors that spread through its corridors were not of political intrigue or foreign threats, but of something far more immediate and personal. Whispers that their sovereign was fading. These were not idle gossips, but observations from the most trusted members of her household. Lady Scrope, one of her most devoted ladies-in-waiting, was heard to confide that the Queen no longer took pleasure in the activities that had once delighted her. She had stopped requesting her favorite books, had ceased to ask for reports on the latest plays being performed in London, and had shown no interest in the new fashions or jewelry that had once occupied hours of her attention. The foreign ambassadors who regularly reported to their monarchs on the English court began to include subtle references to the Queen's health in their dispatches. The Spanish ambassador noted that audiences with the Queen had become increasingly rare and brief. The French ambassador reported that her famous wit, while still sharp when engaged, seemed to require more effort to summon than in previous years. The burden of memory, perhaps most significantly, those closest to Elizabeth began to notice changes in her emotional state that went beyond the physical manifestations of aging. The Queen, who had built her reputation on her ability to compartmentalize personal feelings in service of statecraft, was increasingly given to long periods of contemplation that seemed to serve no political purpose. There had been personal loss that had shaken her to her core. The execution of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in February 1601 had struck a blow from which she would never fully recover. This was not merely the elimination of a political threat, though Essex had indeed betrayed her trust by leading a failed rebellion and attempting to seize power. This was the loss of someone who had represented, in her own complex way, the son she had never had, the romance she had never allowed herself, and the future she had sacrificed for the crown. The relationship between Elizabeth and Essex had been one of the most complicated and emotionally charged of her reign. He was young, brilliant, devastatingly handsome, and possessed of that particular combination of charm and recklessness that had both attracted and terrified her. In him, she had seen echoes of all the men she had loved, but could never marry. Anjou, even perhaps her father in his younger, more magnetic days, but Essex had proven to be as dangerous as he was charismatic. His ambition had grown to match his ego, and his sense of entitlement had eventually led him to believe that he could challenge the crown itself. When he burst into the Queen's private chambers at Nonsuch Palace in September 1599, muddy from his unauthorized return from Ireland, he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. That moment when he saw her without her wig, without her makeup, without the carefully constructed armor of monarchy, had violated not just protocol but the very essence of who Elizabeth I was. The failed rebellion of February 1601 had been almost inevitable. Essex, convinced that he could rally London to his cause, had led a ragtag group of followers through the streets of the capital, expecting the citizens to rise up in his support. Instead, they had stared in confusion and alarm as the man who had once been the Queen's favourite now denounced her rule and claimed to be acting in England's best interests. Elizabeth had faced the choice that every monarch dreads: personal affection versus political necessity. She had loved Essex, in her own way, but she was Queen first and woman second. The death warrant she signed bore her signature, but those who witnessed the moment reported that her hand shook as she wrote her name. The transformation from the moment Essex's head fell on the scaffold of the Tower of London. Witnesses reported that the Queen began to change. It wasn't simply sadness, though that was certainly present. It was as if a deep, corrosive guilt had lodged itself in her soul, eating away at the foundations of her legendary self-confidence. Some claimed she carried a locket containing his portrait, hidden beneath her elaborate gowns. Others swore they heard her mutter his name in the dead of night, when the palace was quiet and the queen thought herself alone. Whether these tales were true or the invention of romantic courtiers seeking to humanize their increasingly distant sovereign, the effect was undeniable. The queen, who had once seemed untouchable, almost divine in her authority, now appeared human and deeply wounded. The guilt she carried was complex and multifaceted. There was personal guilt, the knowledge that she had ordered the death of someone she had loved. There was political guilt, the recognition that her own favoritism had created the monster that Essex had become. And there was perhaps a deeper, more existential guilt, the awareness that her very position as monarch had made genuine human connection impossible. This internal transformation began to manifest in external ways that could not be hidden from the court. Her legendary energy, which had allowed her to dance until dawn and then spend hours in council meetings, began to flag. Her famous temper, which had once been deployed with surgical precision to keep courtiers in line, became more erratic and less effective. Most troubling of all, her interest in the details of governance, the minutiae of statecraft that had once fascinated her, began to wane. The mechanics of decline as winter deepened into 1603. The changes in Elizabeth's behavior became more pronounced and more concerning to those responsible for the smooth functioning of the kingdom. Her daily routines, which had been as regular as clockwork for decades, began to break down. She had always been an early riser, typically beginning her day before dawn with private prayers, and then moving through a carefully choreographed sequence of activities that included dressing, a process that could take hours given the complexity of royal attire, breakfast, correspondence, audiences, and the various ceremonies that marked the passage of time in the Tudor court. Now, however, her ladies-in-waiting often found her already dressed and standing by her window when they arrived to begin their duties. She would have been there for hours, they realized, staring out at the Thames or the palace gardens without apparent purpose. When they attempted to engage her in conversation or to remind her of the day's obligations, she would respond with a distant courtesy that suggested her mind was elsewhere entirely. Her eating habits, always carefully managed both for health and for the symbolic importance of royal dining, became erratic. She would sometimes refuse meals entirely, then suddenly demand food at odd hours. Her cooks, accustomed to preparing elaborate feasts that served both nutritional and ceremonial purposes, found themselves scrambling to accommodate her unpredictable requests. Most concerning of all was her increasing isolation from the business of government. Elizabeth had always been a hands-on monarch, insisting on reviewing important documents personally, meeting with ambassadors, and maintaining direct communication with her various ministers and advisors. Now, these responsibilities were increasingly delegated to her chief ministers, particularly Robert Cecil, who had inherited his father's role as the Queen's most trusted advisor. The court's response to reaction of the court to these changes was complex and multifaceted. On one level, there was genuine concern for the Queen's health and well-being. Many of the courtiers had served her for decades and had developed a genuine affection for her, beyond the formal loyalty required by their positions. On another level, there was growing anxiety about the future. Elizabeth had famously refused to marry or to name a successor, maintaining that she was married to England and that her subjects were her children. This romantic notion had served her well during her prime, allowing her to maintain her independence, while using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool. Now, however, with the Queen clearly aging and in declining health, the question of succession could no longer be avoided. The most likely candidate was James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had executed in 1587. James had a strong claim to the English throne through his great-grandmother, Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. Moreover, he was a Protestant, which would satisfy the religious requirements established by the Reformation. But the prospect of a Scottish king ruling England was not universally welcomed, and the uncertainty surrounding the succession created an atmosphere of tension and anxiety at court. Robert Cecil, now Elizabeth's chief minister, found himself in the delicate position of having to manage both the Queen's declining engagement with government and the growing concerns about the succession. He had already begun secret correspondence with James VI, preparing the groundwork for a smooth transition of power. But he had to be extremely careful to avoid any suggestion of treason or premature assumption of the Queen's death. The foreign ambassadors, meanwhile, were sending increasingly detailed reports to their respective monarchs about the English Queen's condition. The balance of power in Europe might well shift dramatically, depending on who succeeded Elizabeth and what policies they chose to pursue. The Spanish, in particular, were watching the situation closely, hoping that a change in English leadership might provide opportunities to reverse the setbacks they had suffered during Elizabeth's reign. The weight of solitude, perhaps. The most poignant aspect of Elizabeth's decline was the profound loneliness that seemed to envelop her. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people, courtiers, ministers, ladies-in-waiting, guards, servants, yet she had never been able to form the kind of intimate relationships that might have provided emotional support in her final years. The price of monarchy, as Elizabeth had learned early in her reign, was eternal vigilance. She could never fully trust anyone, could never let down her guard, could never allow herself to be seen as merely human. Every relationship was potentially political, every conversation potentially consequential for the kingdom. The result was a kind of emotional isolation that would have been unbearable for most people, but which Elizabeth had accepted as the necessary sacrifice for effective rule. Now, as her physical and mental strength began to wane, this isolation became increasingly difficult to bear. The few people who might have provided genuine companionship, Leicester, Burleigh, Walsingham, were long dead. The younger generation of courtiers, while competent and loyal, had never been allowed to develop the kind of close relationships that might have sustained her in her final years. Essex had been, in many ways, her last attempt to form a genuine emotional connection. His youth, his energy, his apparent devotion had offered her a glimpse of what she had sacrificed for the crown. But even that relationship had been poisoned by the politics of power, ultimately leading to the tragedy that now haunted her final days. The burden of legacy. As Elizabeth faced her mortality, she was also confronting the question of her legacy. She had transformed England from a relatively minor European power into a major player on the world stage. Her religious settlement had brought stability to a nation that had been torn apart by religious conflict. Her court had become a center of learning and artistic achievement that rivaled any in Europe. Her naval victories had established England as a maritime power that would eventually dominate the seas. But what would happen to all of this when she was gone? Would her successor maintain the policies that had made England strong? Would the religious settlements survive? Would the careful balance of power that she had maintained between the various factions at court continue to hold? These questions weighed heavily on Elizabeth's mind as she spent those long hours standing by her window, staring out at the Thames. She had given her entire life to England, had sacrificed marriage, children, and personal happiness for the good of the realm. Now, as death approached, she was faced with the ultimate powerlessness, the inability to control. What would happen after she was gone? The irony was not lost on her that the woman who had been known as the Virgin Queen, who had claimed to be married to England, would leave no heir to carry on her work. The Tudor dynasty, which had transformed England from a medieval kingdom into a modern nation, would die with her. The future of everything she had built would rest in the hands of a stranger, a foreign king whose loyalty to England was untested and whose policies were unknown. Chapter 2. The deepening shadows, the architecture of decliners. The days passed. The gloom that filled Elizabeth I's private chambers at Richmond Palace deepened with an almost palpable weight. The palace itself seemed to reflect the Queen's internal state, its once vibrant halls now echoing with an uncharacteristic silence that unsettled everyone who walked through them. Richmond Palace had been transformed during Elizabeth's reign into one of the most magnificent royal residences in Europe. Its great hall, with its soaring ceilings and magnificent tapestries, had witnessed some of the most important moments in English history. The Queen's private apartments, located in the palace's most secure wing, had been decorated with the finest art and furnishings that the kingdom could provide. Persian carpets covered the floors, Venetian glass adorned the windows, and paintings by the greatest masters of the age hung on the walls. But now, these magnificent surroundings seemed to mock the frail figure who inhabited them. The Queen, who had once moved through these spaces with the confidence of absolute authority, now seemed diminished by their grandeur. The elaborate furnishings, the precious objects, the symbols of royal power, all of these now served only to emphasize the mortality of the woman who had once seemed immortal. The transformation of court life. The once vibrant court, famous throughout Europe for its music, pageantry, and lively discourse had undergone a profound transformation. The cultural flowering that had characterized Elizabeth's reign, the age of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser, had been nurtured by a queen who genuinely loved learning and artistic achievement. She had been a patron of the arts, not merely for political reasons, but because she found genuine pleasure in intellectual discourse and creative expression. Now, however, the court had grown hushed and subdued. The elaborate entertainments that had once been regular features of court life, the masques, the musical performances, the dramatic presentations, had been suspended indefinitely. The queen, who had once delighted in these spectacles and had often participated in them herself, now showed no interest in such diversions. The absence of these cultural activities had a profound effect on the entire court ecosystem. The musicians, poets, and actors who had once competed for royal favor found themselves without an audience. The courtiers who had once vied to demonstrate their wit and sophistication in the queen's presence now found themselves with little to do but whisper anxiously about her health. The very rhythm of court life, which had been structured around the queen's preferences and schedule, began to break down. The elaborate ceremonies that had marked the passage of time in the Tudor court, the formal meals, the ceremonial audiences, the religious observances continued, but they felt hollow without the queen's active participation. The isolation of power. The queen, who had dazzled Europe with her wit and resolve, was now wrapped in heavy silks and surrounded by shadows and silence. The contrast between her past and present self was stark and deeply troubling to those who had known her in her prime. This was the same woman who had delivered the speech at Tilbury that had inspired the English fleet to victory over the Spanish Armada, who had negotiated with the finest diplomatic minds of her age, who had created a court that was renowned throughout Europe for its sophistication and learning. The physical manifestations of this transformation were perhaps the most disturbing. Elizabeth had always been meticulous about her appearance, understanding that royal image was a crucial component of political power. Her elaborate gowns, her carefully applied makeup, her jeweled accessories, all of these had been weapons in her political arsenal, tools for projecting strength and authority. Now, however, she seemed to have lost interest in these external manifestations of power. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she would sometimes wear the same gown for days, that she would forget to put on her jewelry, that she would sit for hours without speaking while they attempted to dress her hair. The queen, who had once insisted on perfection in every detail of her appearance, now seemed indifferent to how she looked. The gradual dismissal. She no longer held the regular council meetings that had been the cornerstone of her governmental system. For decades, Elizabeth had insisted on personal involvement in every major decision affecting the kingdom. Her Privy Council, composed of her most trusted advisers, had met regularly to discuss domestic and foreign policy, but the Queen had always maintained final authority over all important matters. Now, these meetings continued, but without the Queen's presence. Robert Cecil, who had assumed many of his father's responsibilities, found himself making decisions that would once have required the Queen's personal approval. This was a dangerous situation, as it raised questions about the legitimacy of governmental actions taken without the monarch's direct involvement. The Queen's absence from these meetings was particularly concerning because it came at a time when England faced several significant challenges. The ongoing conflict in Ireland required constant attention and resources. Relations with Spain, while improved since the defeat of the Armada, remained tense. The succession question, which Elizabeth had consistently refused to address, was becoming increasingly urgent as her health declined. That her usual rides through the palace gardens, which had been both a form of exercise and a way of maintaining visibility to her household, had been discontinued. These rides had served multiple purposes. They had allowed the Queen to maintain her physical fitness. They had provided opportunities for informal conversations with courtiers, and they had demonstrated her continued vitality to anyone who might doubt her capacity to rule. The gardens themselves, which had been one of Elizabeth's great pleasures, now stood largely empty. She had taken a personal interest in their design and maintenance, often spending hours walking among the flowers and discussing botanical matters with her gardeners. The loss of this simple pleasure was perhaps symbolic of the broader changes affecting her life. The dismissal of intimacy. Her ladies-in-waiting, the closest and most trusted women in her life, were being dismissed one by one from her presence. This was perhaps the most alarming development of all. as these women had served not just as attendants but as confidants and companions. They had been privy to the Queen's private thoughts and feelings, had witnessed her moments of vulnerability, and had provided the emotional support that her position otherwise made impossible. Lady Scrope, who had served Elizabeth for over 20 years, was one of the few allowed to remain. Even she, however, found her access to the Queen increasingly restricted. Where once she had been able to engage Elizabeth in conversation about court gossip, literary works, or political developments, now she found herself speaking to a woman who seemed only partially present, whose attention appeared to be focused on matters invisible to others. The other ladies-in-waiting, some of whom had served the Queen for decades, found themselves effectively retired from their positions. This was not done through any formal decree, but through the Queen's simple lack of interest in their services. Women who had once been among the most powerful figures at court, who had controlled access to the Queen and had wielded considerable influence over appointments and policies, now found themselves relegated to minor ceremonial roles. This gradual dismissal of her most intimate companions left Elizabeth increasingly isolated. The few people she allowed to remain in her presence, Lady Scrope, a handful of trusted servants, her personal physicians, spoke only in soft, uncertain tones, unsure whether their presence comforted or agitated her. The troubled mind those who were permitted to observe the Queen closely began to report that her mind was showing signs of distress. This was perhaps the most frightening development of all, as Elizabeth's intellectual capacity had been one of her greatest assets as a ruler. Her ability to analyze complex political situations, to remember vast amounts of detail, to engage in sophisticated diplomatic negotiations, all of these had been crucial to her success as a monarch. Now, however, there were signs that this mental acuity was being compromised. She would sometimes forget the names of courtiers she had known for years. She would begin conversations and then lose track of what she had been saying. Most troubling of all, she would sometimes speak to people who were not present, carrying on conversations with individuals who had died years earlier. These episodes were carefully concealed from the broader court, but they could not be hidden from those who attended the Queen daily. The implications were terrifying. If the Queen's mind was failing, then the kingdom was effectively without a ruler. The governmental structures that had served England so well during Elizabeth's reign were entirely dependent on her personal authority. Without her active participation, these structures might collapse, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to internal chaos and external threats. The refusal of rest was during this period that the Queen's physicians began to observe something particularly troubling. Not only was Elizabeth refusing food, but she had also started to resist sleep altogether. This was not merely insomnia, a common affliction among those under stress, but a deliberate refusal to engage in the natural rhythms of human existence. She would stand for hours on end, rooted to the same spot by her bed or by the window, as if the very act of lying down might bring death closer. This behavior was so unusual that it alarmed even her most experienced attendants. They had seen the Queen work long hours, had witnessed her push herself to the limits of human endurance during times of crisis, but this was different. This was a woman who seemed to be fighting against her own humanity. When her legs could no longer support her, she would sit stiffly on cushions, her eyes fixed on some invisible point, her lips moving silently in prayer or thought. The prayers, when they could be overheard, were not the formal religious observances that had been part of her daily routine for decades, but desperate, personal pleas that revealed the depth of her spiritual distress. Some of her attendants speculated that she feared death not as a woman but as a ruler. For decades, Elizabeth I had been the embodiment of England itself. Her personal identity had become so intertwined with her role as monarch that the prospect of ceasing to exist as a person was inseparable from the fear of England ceasing to exist as a nation. To die meant to relinquish control of her people, her image, and her power. Perhaps that was what she truly feared, the end of control. The physical manifestations, the Queen's physical decline during this period was both subtle and alarming. She developed a persistent cough that seemed to worsen during the night hours when the palace was quiet. This cough was not merely an annoyance, but a source of considerable discomfort that made her reluctance to lie down even more understandable. The sound of her coughing echoed through the corridors of Richmond Palace, a constant reminder to everyone within earshot of her deteriorating condition. Her skin, which had always been pale but healthy, turned increasingly ashen. The elaborate Cosmetics that had once created the illusion of porcelain, perfection now seemed to emphasize rather than conceal the signs of illness. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that applying her makeup had become increasingly difficult, as her skin had become sensitive and her patience for the lengthy process had disappeared. Perhaps most alarming of all was the visible weight loss. Elizabeth had never been a large woman, but she had always maintained the robust appearance appropriate to her position. Now, her frame seemed to shrink beneath her ornate gowns, making her appear almost childlike in her elaborate royal attire. The clothing that had once fit her perfectly now hung loosely, requiring constant adjustments by her seamstresses. This physical deterioration was particularly troubling because it was accompanied by the Queen's continued refusal to allow proper medical examination. Her vanity, even in sickness, remained intact. She would not permit her physicians to examine her too closely, insisting that the dignity of monarchy required certain boundaries to be maintained, even in illness. The unanswered questions through all of these changes. One question loomed in every courtier's mind, but was rarely voiced aloud. Was this simply old age catching up to the Queen, or was something more sinister at work? The ambiguity surrounding Elizabeth's condition made it impossible for anyone to know how to respond appropriately. If this was merely the natural decline of advanced age, then perhaps the Queen deserved to be left in peace to face her final days with dignity. But if there was some treatable illness involved, then the failure to provide proper medical care might be seen as a dereliction of duty to the Crown and the kingdom. The physicians who were permitted to observe the Queen from a distance offered conflicting opinions. Some believed that her symptoms were consistent with the natural aging process, exacerbated by the stress of decades of rule. Others suspected that grief and melancholy had created a condition that modern medicine would recognize as severe depression, but which Tudor medicine was ill-equipped to address. The answer, for now, remained locked behind her lips that had once commanded empires and negotiated with the greatest powers of Europe, but which now barely moved at all. The woman who had been known for her eloquence, her wit, and her ability to inspire loyalty through the power of her words had become almost mute, leaving those around her to guess at her thoughts and feelings. The implications of this silence extended far beyond the Queen's personal suffering. England's entire governmental system was built around the principle of royal authority. Laws were made in the Queen's name, justice was administered in her name, and the very legitimacy of the state depended on her active participation in the machinery of government. A silent queen was, in many ways, a non-existent queen, and a non-existent queen posed an existential threat to the kingdom itself. The deepening crises. The winter of 1603 wore on. The crisis, deepening around Elizabeth's condition, began to affect every aspect of English life. The uncertainty surrounding the Queen's health created a climate of anxiety that extended far beyond the court. Merchants worried about the stability of trade relationships, military commanders questioned the continuity of strategic policies, and ordinary citizens began to express concerns about the future of the kingdom. The foreign ambassadors, who had initially been discreet in their reports about the Queen's condition, began to send increasingly urgent dispatches to their home countries. The balance of power in Europe was delicately poised, and the prospect of England's sudden weakness or instability could have far-reaching consequences for the entire continent. Spain, in particular, was watching the situation with keen interest. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had been a devastating blow to Spanish prestige and power, but the Spanish court had never abandoned its hopes of eventually bringing England back under Catholic influence. A weak or unstable England might provide the opportunity for Spanish intervention that had been denied to them for decades. France, too, was concerned about the implications of Elizabeth's decline. The complex web of alliances and rivalries that had characterized European politics during her reign might be completely disrupted by her death and the accession of a new monarch with different policies and priorities. Within England itself, the various factions that had been held in check by Elizabeth's strong leadership began to maneuver for position in anticipation of the succession. The religious tensions that had been largely suppressed during her reign between Protestants and Catholics, between moderate and radical Puritans, began to resurface as different groups calculated their chances under a new monarch. The economic implications of the uncertainty were also significant. Trade with the continent, which had flourished under Elizabeth's stable rule, began to suffer as merchants hesitated to make long-term commitments in an uncertain political environment. The complex system of royal monopolies and trade privileges that had been carefully constructed over decades might be completely restructured under a new monarch. The isolation deepens as Elizabeth's condition continued to deteriorate. Her isolation from the normal functioning of government became increasingly complete. The woman who had once insisted on reviewing every important document, on meeting personally with every significant visitor, on maintaining direct control over every aspect of policy, now seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from the realm she had ruled for so long. This isolation was not merely physical but spiritual and emotional. The Queen, who had once been the center of a vibrant court culture, who had inspired poets and artists, who had been celebrated throughout Europe for her intellect and sophistication, now seemed to be withdrawing from all human contact. The few people who were still permitted in her presence reported that she seemed to look through them rather than at them, as if they were not entirely real or present. The implications of this withdrawal were profound. Elizabeth had always governed through personal relationships, through her ability to inspire loyalty and devotion in those who served her. The elaborate court ceremonies, the carefully orchestrated public appearances, the personal audiences with important visitors, all of these had been tools for maintaining the personal connections that made effective government possible. Now, with the Queen effectively absent from these processes, the entire system of royal government was beginning to break down. Decisions were being made by her ministers without her input, policies were being implemented without her approval, and the kingdom was being governed by people who lacked the ultimate authority that only the monarch could provide. This situation was unprecedented in English history. Previous monarchs had faced periods of illness or incapacity, but never had a ruler simply withdrawn from the business of government while remaining technically alive and on the throne. The constitutional implications were staggering, and there was no legal or political framework for dealing with such a situation. The answer, as it had always been in the Tudor monarchy, lay entirely in the hands of the monarch herself. But Elizabeth, the Queen, who had once been known for her decisiveness and her ability to act quickly in times of crisis, now seemed incapable of action of any kind. The kingdom that had been built on her personal authority now faced the prospect of continuing without that authority, and no one knew whether such a thing was possible. Chapter 3. The Ghosts of the Heart, the Spectre of Essex. To truly understand the crushing weight pressing down on Elizabeth I in her final weeks, one must examine not only the physical deterioration of her body, but the profound wounds that had been inflicted upon her heart. And at the center of these wounds was the ghost that haunted her most persistently, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, whose presence seemed to linger in every shadow of Richmond Palace. The relationship between Elizabeth and Essex had been one of the most complex and emotionally charged of her entire reign. It had begun in the 1580s when Essex, then barely 20 years old, had first appeared at court as the stepson of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the great love of Elizabeth's life. In Essex, Elizabeth had seen not only Leicester's heir, but perhaps a chance to recapture some of the passion and vitality that had characterized her relationship with his stepfather. Essex was everything that the aging Queen found irresistible: young, brilliant, devastatingly handsome, and possessed of that particular combination of charm and recklessness that had both attracted and terrified her. He had the kind of magnetic personality that could fill a room with energy, the sort of presence that made other courtiers seem pale and insignificant by comparison. In him, Elizabeth had seen echoes of all the men she had loved but could never marry. There was something of Leicester in his confidence and charm, something of her father Henry VIII in his commanding presence and dangerous unpredictability, something even of Thomas Seymour, her first love, in his ability to make her feel simultaneously protected and vulnerable. But Essex had also represented something more profound. He had been her last, desperate attempt to experience the kind of passionate human connection that her position as monarch had always denied her. In their relationship, which had spanned nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth had allowed herself to feel emotions that she had carefully suppressed in all her other dealings. She had permitted herself to be jealous when he flirted with other women, to be protective when he faced danger, to be genuinely happy in his company in ways that she had never allowed herself to be with other courtiers. The dangerous dance of favor. The relationship between Elizabeth and Essex had been a dangerous dance of favor and disfavor, advancement and disgrace, that had kept the entire court on edge for years. Essex's youth and energy had revitalized the aging Queen, but his arrogance and ambition had repeatedly brought him into conflict with her authority. He had been granted extraordinary privileges that no other courtier had ever enjoyed. He had been allowed to enter the Queen's private chambers without ceremony, to interrupt her meetings with other officials, to speak to her with a familiarity that would have been treasonous from anyone else. She had showered him with honors, titles, and wealth, elevating him from a relatively minor nobleman to one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. But Essex had interpreted these favors not as gifts to be treasured but as rights to be expected. His sense of entitlement had grown with each promotion, each grant of land, each mark of royal favor. He had begun to behave as if he were above the normal rules that governed court behavior, as if his special relationship with the Queen gave him license to act without constraint. This arrogance had manifested itself in numerous ways. He had openly quarreled with other courtiers, secure in the knowledge that the Queen would protect him. He had defied her direct orders, confident that his charm could overcome her anger. He had pursued his own political agenda, sometimes in direct opposition to royal policy, believing that his influence over Elizabeth would ultimately prevail. The pattern had been established early in their relationship and had repeated itself. Countless times, Essex would overstep his bounds. Elizabeth would be forced to discipline him. He would submit and beg for forgiveness, and she would eventually relent and restore him to favor. Each cycle had seemed to strengthen his belief that he was indispensable to her, that she could not function without him, that he could push the boundaries of acceptable behavior without facing real consequences. The Irish catastrophe, the beginning of the end for Essex, had come with his appointment as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1599. The Irish campaign had been one of the most challenging military operations of Elizabeth's reign, a complex struggle against Irish chieftains who had been supported by Spanish gold and weapons. The appointment had been seen as a great honor, a chance for Essex to prove his military capabilities and add to his already considerable reputation. But Essex had approached the Irish campaign with the same arrogance and lack of preparation that had characterized many of his other endeavors. He had assumed that his personal magnetism and military reputation would be sufficient to overcome the tactical and logistical challenges of fighting in Ireland. He had dismissed the warnings of more experienced military commanders, had ignored the strategic advice of his own officers, and had pursued a campaign that was both expensive and ineffective. The results had been disastrous. Instead of the quick victory that Essex had promised, the Irish campaign had dragged on for months, consuming vast amounts of money and manpower while achieving virtually nothing. Essex had found himself facing skilled guerrilla fighters who were familiar with the terrain and supported by the local population. His traditional military tactics, which might have been effective in conventional European warfare, had proven useless against enemies who refused to fight pitched battles. Worse still, Essex had begun to negotiate with the Irish chieftains without authorization from London. He had apparently believed that he could achieve through diplomacy what he had failed to accomplish through military force. But these negotiations had been viewed by Elizabeth and her council as potentially treasonous, as they had involved discussions of terms that went far beyond Essex's authority to grant. The final blow had come when Essex had abandoned his post in Ireland and returned to England without permission. He had burst into the Queen's private chambers at Virgin Palace in September 1599, muddy from his journey, desperate to explain his actions and to restore himself to her favor. But in doing so, he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The violation of majesty, that moment when Essex had seen Elizabeth without her wig, without her makeup, without the carefully constructed armor of monarchy, had violated not just protocol but the very essence of who Elizabeth I was. The Queen's appearance was not merely personal vanity, but a crucial component of her political power. The elaborate wigs, the white lead makeup, the magnificent gowns, all of these had been tools for creating the image of a monarch who was somehow more than human, who possessed a divine authority that set her apart from ordinary mortals. For Essex to see her as she truly was, an aging woman, vulnerable and mortal, had been a violation of the mystique that was essential to royal authority. It had been an intimate intrusion that no amount of charm or apology could undo. In that moment, Essex had ceased to be a beloved favorite and had become a threat to the very foundations of Elizabeth's power. The Queen's reaction had been swift and decisive. Essex had been placed under house arrest, stripped of his offices, and barred from court. For a man who had been accustomed to unlimited access to the Queen, who had built his entire identity around his special relationship with her. This punishment had been devastating. He had been cut off from the source of his power, isolated from the world that had given his life meaning. But Elizabeth's punishment of Essex had been motivated by more than political calculation. It had been a desperate attempt to restore the distance between monarch and subject that was essential to royal authority. She had been forced to destroy the relationship that had brought her the greatest personal happiness in order to preserve the institution that she had sworn to protect. The descent into rebellion. Essex's response to his disgrace had been to retreat into a world of resentment and conspiracy. Deprived of his normal outlets for ambition and energy, he had begun to surround himself with disaffected courtiers and military veterans who shared his grievances against the Queen's government. These men, many of whom had served with Essex in Ireland or in other military campaigns, had their own reasons for dissatisfaction with the current regime. The group that gathered round Essex in his London residence had included some of the most dangerous men in England. There had been military commanders who believed that England's foreign policy was too cautious, courtiers who felt that they had been unfairly excluded from power, and idealists who believed that the Queen's government had become corrupt and ineffective. United by their loyalty to Essex and their shared sense of grievance, they had begun to discuss the possibility of forcing change through direct action. The conversations in Essex House had gradually moved from complaints about specific policies to broader questions about the nature of royal authority. Some of Essex's supporters had begun to argue that the Queen, now aging and apparently under the influence of corrupt advisors, was no longer capable of effective rule. They had suggested that it might be necessary to take action to liberate her from the evil influences that surrounded her, and to restore good government to England. Essex himself had been torn between his continued love for Elizabeth and his growing conviction that she had been turned against him by his enemies at court. He had apparently believed that if he could only speak with her directly, if he could explain his position and demonstrate his continued loyalty, she would restore him to favor and punish those who had poisoned her mind against him. This delusional thinking had been encouraged by the flattery of his supporters, who had convinced him that he was the only person capable of saving England from the incompetence and corruption that they believed characterized the current government. They had told him that the people of London would rise up to support him if he took action against the Queen's evil advisers, that the military would rally to his cause, that he could seize power and rule as regent until Elizabeth came to her senses. The failed rebellion, the rebellion that Essex had launched in February 1601, had been almost pathetically inadequate. Instead of the massive popular uprising that his supporters had predicted, the people of London had stared in confusion and alarm as Essex and his followers had marched through the streets, denouncing the Queen's government and calling for support. That never materialized. That the citizens of London had no interest in rebellion. They had prospered under Elizabeth's rule, had seen England grow in wealth and power, and had no desire to overthrow a government that had served them well. The idea that they would spontaneously rise up to support a disgraced courtier had been a fantasy born of Essex's own desperation and his supporters' flattery. The military response had been swift and effective. The Queen's forces, led by experienced commanders who remained loyal to the crown, had quickly surrounded Essex and his followers. The rebellion had collapsed within hours, with most of Essex's supporters surrendering without a fight. The man, who had once been the most powerful courtier in England, had been reduced to hiding in his own house, waiting for the inevitable arrest. The aftermath of the rebellion had been even more devastating than its failure. Essex and his principal supporters had been charged with treason, the most serious crime in English law. The evidence against them had been overwhelming. They had taken up arms against the Queen's government, had attempted to seize control of the capital, and had proclaimed their intention to rule in the Queen's name. There had been no possibility of acquittal, no hope of mercy. The impossible choice. Elizabeth had faced the choice that every monarch dreads: personal affection versus political necessity. She had loved Essex, in her own complicated way, but she was queen first and woman second. The survival of the monarchy, the stability of the kingdom, the authority of the crown, all of these had taken precedence over her personal feelings. The decision to execute Essex had been one of the most difficult of Elizabeth's reign. She had spent days agonizing over the death warrant, signing it and then revoking it, torn between her duty as a monarch and her feelings as a woman. Her counselors had urged her to show mercy, arguing that Essex's youth and previous service to the crown warranted clemency. But Elizabeth had understood what they perhaps did not, that mercy in this case would be seen as weakness, that pardoning Essex would encourage other ambitious courtiers to believe that they too could rebel against royal authority without facing the ultimate consequences. The death warrant that she had finally signed had borne her signature, but those who had witnessed the moment reported that her hand had shaken as she wrote her name. She had known that she was not merely ordering the execution of a traitor but destroying the last vestiges of her own capacity for human love. In killing Essex, she had been killing a part of herself. The aftermath of execution of Essex on February 25, 1601, had been carried out with the full ceremony appropriate to a nobleman's death. He had been allowed to make a final speech in which he had acknowledged his guilt and asked for forgiveness. He had died with dignity, maintaining his composure even as the axe fell. But his death had marked the end of more than just his own life. It had marked the end of Elizabeth's ability to form meaningful emotional connections with other human beings. From the moment Essex's head had fallen on the scaffold at the Tower of London, witnesses had reported that the Queen had begun to change. It had not been simply sadness, though that had certainly been present. It had been as if a deep, corrosive guilt had lodged itself in her soul, eating away at the foundations of her legendary self-confidence. The guilt she had carried had been complex and multifaceted. There had been personal guilt, the knowledge that she had ordered the death of someone she had loved. There had been political guilt, the recognition that her own favoritism had created the monster that Essex had become. And there had been perhaps a deeper, more existential guilt, the awareness that her very position as monarch had made genuine human connection impossible. The lingering presence now, in her final days, Essex's presence seemed to haunt every corner of Richmond Palace. Some claimed she carried a locket containing his portrait, hidden beneath her elaborate gowns where no one could see it. The locket, if it existed, would have been more than a simple memento. It would have been a tangible reminder of the price she had paid for the crown, a constant symbol of the human sacrifices that monarchy had demanded. Others swore they heard her mutter his name in the dead of night, when the palace was quiet and the Queen thought herself alone. These whispered conversations with the dead had been reported by servants who had been awakened by the sound of the Queen's voice echoing through the corridors. They had described hearing her side of what appeared to be a dialogue, as if she were responding to words that only she could hear. Whether these tales were true or the invention of romantic courtiers seeking to humanize their increasingly distant sovereign, the effect was undeniable. The Queen, who had once seemed untouchable, almost divine in her authority, now appeared human and deeply wounded. The transformation had been visible to anyone who had known her before Essex's death. The confident, commanding monarch had been replaced by a frail, haunted woman who seemed to be carrying the weight of unbearable sorrow. The complexity of grief, the grief that Elizabeth had experienced following Essex's execution, had been unlike anything she had faced before. She had buried many people she had loved during her long reign: Leicester, Burleigh, Walsingham, her half-sister, Mary, but none of those deaths had affected her in the same way. Those had been natural deaths, the inevitable result of age and illness. Essex's death had been different because it had been her choice, her decision, her action. The complexity of her feelings had been compounded by the fact that she had been forced to maintain the public facade of a monarch who had acted decisively in the face of treason. She could not publicly mourn Essex without seeming to question her own decision to execute him. She could not express regret without appearing weak or indecisive. She had been forced to carry her grief in silence, to process her emotions without the support that might have been available to a private person. This emotional isolation had been made worse by the fact that few people at court had understood the true nature of her relationship with Essex. To most observers, he had been simply another courtier who had overreached and faced the consequences. They had not seen the private moments of tenderness, the genuine affection that had existed between them, the way his presence had brought light into her otherwise isolated existence. The few people who had understood the depth of her attachment to Essex had been those who had witnessed their private interactions over the years. These courtiers had seen how the Queen's entire demeanor had changed when Essex entered a room, how she had become more animated and engaged in his presence, how she had seemed to find in him a source of joy that had been absent from her relationships with other courtiers. The weight of responsibility as Elizabeth had faced her final days, the weight of responsibility for Essex's fate had become increasingly unbearable. she had begun to question not just the specific decision to execute him, but the entire system of values that had guided her reign. Had she been right to place the demands of monarchy above the claims of human affection? Had she been justified in sacrificing personal happiness for political stability? Had the price of effective rule been too high? These questions had no easy answers, and Elizabeth had been forced to confront them alone. The courtiers who surrounded her could offer no comfort because they could not understand the true nature of her dilemma. The ministers who had advised her to execute Essex had done so from purely political motives. They had not been forced to balance political necessity against personal love. The religious advisers who might have offered spiritual comfort had been constrained by the official doctrine that the monarch was God's representative on earth, that her decisions were divinely inspired, that questioning royal authority was tantamount to questioning God himself. They could not acknowledge that the Queen might have made a mistake without undermining the entire theological foundation of her rule. The transformation of memory in her final weeks. Elizabeth's memories of Essex had begun to take on an idealized quality that bore little resemblance to the complex, flawed man he had actually been. In her mind, he had become not the arrogant, reckless courtier who had betrayed her trust, but the young, charming, devoted companion who had brought warmth and vitality into her life. This transformation of memory had been both a blessing and a curse. It had allowed her to remember the good times they had shared, the moments of genuine happiness that had been all too rare in her life. But it had also made his loss seem even more tragic, had made her decision to execute him seem even more cruel and unnecessary. The idealized Essex who haunted her final days had been a creation of her own grief and guilt, a phantom composed of her regrets and her need for human connection. This phantom had been more real to her than the living people who surrounded her, more compelling than the business of government that had once consumed her attention. The broader implications, the psychological impact of Essex's execution on Elizabeth had had broader implications for the kingdom as a whole. The Queen, who had once been known for her decisiveness and her ability to separate personal feelings from political necessity, had become hesitant and withdrawn. The loss of her emotional anchor had affected her ability to function effectively as a ruler. The uncertainty surrounding the succession, which had always been a source of anxiety for her subjects, had become acute as Elizabeth's health declined. Her refusal to name a successor had once been seen as a shrewd political strategy, a way of maintaining her bargaining power with foreign rulers and domestic factions. Now, however, it seemed like the decision of a woman who was too emotionally damaged to face the reality of her own mortality. The various crises that had faced England during her final years, the ongoing conflict in Ireland, the economic problems caused by expensive foreign wars, the religious tensions that had never been fully resolved had all been made worse by the Queen's emotional unavailability. The decisive leadership that had characterized her earlier reign had been replaced by a kind of paralysis that left important decisions unmade and important problems unresolved. The phantom's influences. Elizabeth's physical condition had continued to deteriorate. The influence of Essex's phantom had seemed to grow stronger. She had begun to speak of him as if he were still alive, to consult him on matters of state, to seek his approval for decisions that she was no longer capable of making. Effectively, that this psychological dependence on a dead man had been deeply troubling to those who observed it. It had suggested that the Queen was no longer entirely rational, that her grip on reality was slipping, that she might be suffering from the kind of mental illness that would make her unfit to rule. The implications of this development had been staggering. If the Queen was indeed mentally incapacitated, then England was effectively without a ruler. The governmental structures that had served the kingdom so well during her reign had been entirely dependent on her personal authority. Without her active participation, these structures might collapse, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to internal chaos and external threats. But there had been no legal or political mechanism for dealing with such a situation. The concept of royal incapacity had no place in Tudor political theory, which held that the monarch was God's representative on earth, and therefore incapable of error or inadequacy. To acknowledge that the Queen might be mentally ill would have been to undermine the entire foundation of royal authority. The deepening isolation as the ghost of Essex had taken an increasingly prominent place in Elizabeth's consciousness. Her connection to the living world had continued to weaken. The few people who were still permitted in her presence had found themselves competing with a phantom for her attention, trying to engage a woman whose thoughts were increasingly focused on someone who existed only in her memory. This deepening isolation had been particularly tragic because it had come at a time when Elizabeth had most needed human comfort and support. The approach of death, which she had apparently sensed even if she had not acknowledged it explicitly, had made her desperate for the kind of emotional connection that her position had always denied her. But the very intensity of her need for connection had made it impossible for her to accept the limited forms of companionship that were available to her. The formal relationships that characterized court life had seemed inadequate compared to the passionate, if ultimately destructive, relationships she had shared with Essex. The living courtiers who surrounded her had seemed pale and insignificant compared to the idealized phantom who inhabited her memory. That the result had been a kind of emotional death that had preceded her physical demise. Long before her body had finally failed, Elizabeth had ceased to exist as a fully human being. She had become a kind of living ghost herself, present in body but absent in spirit, going through the motions of royal life, while her true self remained focused on a world that existed only in her. Memory. Chapter 4. The melancholy of monarchy. Medical understanding of grief. The grief that consumed Elizabeth, in her final days, would have been poorly understood by the medical practitioners of her time. What we now recognize as clinical depression, post-traumatic stress, or complicated grief would have been diagnosed in 1603 as melancholia, a spiritual and physical imbalance that was believed to result from an excess of black bile, one of the four humors that were thought to govern human health and temperament. According to the medical theories of the day, melancholia was characterized by sadness, withdrawal, loss of appetite, and disturbed sleep, all symptoms that Elizabeth was displaying in alarming abundance. The prescribed treatments typically included bloodletting to restore the balance of humors, herbal remedies to purge the system of corrupted substances, and spiritual counseling to address the moral and religious dimensions of the condition. But Elizabeth's physicians faced a unique challenge in treating their royal patient. The Queen's status as God's representative on earth made it theologically problematic to suggest that she was suffering from a spiritual imbalance. Moreover, her absolute authority over the realm meant that any treatment would require her consent, that she was increasingly unwilling to give. Dr. John Dee, the Queen's longtime personal physician and advisor, had been one of the few people allowed to observe her condition closely during her final weeks. A man of exceptional learning who combined medical practice with interests in astronomy, mathematics, and what would later be called chemistry, Dee had been troubled by what he had witnessed. In his private notes, which would survive for centuries after his death, Dee had recorded his observations of the Queen's condition with the careful attention to detail that characterized his scientific approach to medicine. He had noted the physical symptoms, the weight loss, the persistent cough, the pale complexion, but he had also documented the behavioral changes that suggested a deeper disturbance. The symptoms of despair, the Queen's refusal to eat, had been one of the most concerning aspects of her condition. This was not merely a loss of appetite, which might have been expected in a woman of her age, but an active rejection of food that seemed to go beyond normal illness. She would sometimes stare at elaborate meals that had been prepared specifically for her, displaying no interest in foods that had once been among her favorites. When pressed by her attendants to take nourishment, she would sometimes respond with a weary gesture that suggested eating required more energy than she possessed. On other occasions, she would simply turn away without explanation, as if the very sight of food was somehow offensive to her. This behavior had been particularly alarming because Elizabeth had always been known for her healthy appetite and her appreciation of fine cuisine. The royal kitchens at Richmond Palace had been staffed by some of the finest cooks in Europe, and the Queen had traditionally taken great pleasure in the elaborate meals that were served at court functions. Her sudden indifference to food had been seen by those who knew her well as a sign that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with life itself. The sleep disturbances had been equally troubling. Elizabeth had always been a light sleeper, a trait that had served her well during the various crises of her reign, when she had needed to be available for urgent consultations at all hours. But now, she seemed to have moved beyond mere insomnia to a state of active resistance to sleep. Her ladies-in-waiting had reported finding her standing by her window in the early hours of the morning, still dressed in the clothes she had worn the previous day, staring out at the Thames with an expression of profound sadness. When they had attempted to persuade her to rest, she had sometimes responded that she was not tired, but her physical appearance had suggested otherwise. The posture of despair, Queen's physical posture during her final weeks had been particularly revealing to those who understood the symbolic importance of royal bearing. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had been meticulous about maintaining the erect, commanding posture that was considered essential to royal dignity. She had trained herself to walk, sit, and stand in ways that projected authority and strength, understanding that her physical presence was a crucial component of her political power. Now, however, her posture had changed in ways that suggested a fundamental alteration in her relationship with her own authority. Instead of the strict, confident bearing that had characterized her public appearances, she had begun to stoop and slump in ways that made her appear smaller and more fragile. When she stood, which she did for hours at a time, her shoulders would sag forward and her head would tilt downward, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. When she sat, she would often lean to one side or rest her head in her hands, abandoning the formal postures that had once been second nature to her. These changes in posture had been subtle but significant. They had suggested that the Queen was no longer making the conscious effort to project strength and authority that had once been so important to her. The careful performance of monarchy, which had been one of her greatest skills, had begun to break down as she lost the energy and motivation to maintain it. The silence of authority, perhaps most troubling of all, had been the Queen's increasing silence. Elizabeth had always been known for her eloquence, her wit, and her ability to use language as a tool of statecraft. Her speeches had inspired armies, her diplomatic negotiations had secured crucial alliances, and her personal conversations had won the loyalty of countless courtiers and subjects. Now, however, she had become almost mute. The woman who had once been capable of delivering lengthy, impromptu addresses on complex political topics would now sit for hours without speaking. When she did speak, her words were often monosyllabic and seemed to require considerable effort. To produce this silence had been particularly devastating because it had effectively ended her ability to govern. The Tudor monarchy was built on the principle of royal authority, but that authority depended on the monarch's ability to communicate her will to her subjects. A silent queen was, in practical terms, a powerless queen. The implications of this development had extended far beyond the Queen's personal condition. The entire machinery of government had been designed to function through royal commands and directives, without the Queen's active participation in the decision-making process. Her ministers had been forced to make increasingly important decisions on their own authority, creating a constitutional crisis that had no precedent in English history. The withdrawal from ceremony, the elaborate ceremonies that had been central to Elizabeth's reign, had also begun to break down as her condition deteriorated. The daily rituals of court life, the formal meals, the ceremonial audiences, the religious observances, had all been designed to reinforce the sacred nature of royal authority and to provide structure for the complex social hierarchies that surrounded the throne. Elizabeth had always understood the importance of these ceremonies and had participated in them with the seriousness they deserved. She had known that every public appearance was a performance, every gesture a statement about the nature of royal power, every word a potential tool for advancing her political agenda. Now, however, she had begun to withdraw from these ceremonial obligations. The formal meals continued, but often without the Queen's presence. The religious services in the palace chapel proceeded, but with an empty royal pew. The audiences with foreign ambassadors were conducted by her ministers, rather than by the Queen herself. This withdrawal had been particularly damaging, because it had made the Queen seem absent and disengaged at a time when the kingdom needed strong leadership. The various crises facing England, the ongoing conflict in Ireland, the economic strains of expensive foreign wars, the uncertainty surrounding the succession had all required the kind of decisive action that only the monarch could provide. The spiritual dimension, the religious aspects of Elizabeth's condition had been particularly complex and troubling. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she had been responsible not only for the political governance of the realm, but for its spiritual welfare as well. The religious settlement that she had established early in her reign had brought stability to a nation that had been torn apart by religious conflict, but it had also placed enormous spiritual burdens on the monarch herself. Elizabeth had always taken her religious responsibilities seriously, understanding that her legitimacy as queen depended partly on her role as God's representative on earth. She had attended daily prayers, had participated in the elaborate religious ceremonies that marked the church calendar, and had maintained the careful balance between Protestant and Catholic, elements that had been essential to religious peace. Now, however, her relationship with religious observance had become complicated by her emotional state. Her attendants had reported that she continued to pray, but her prayers had taken on a desperate, pleading quality that suggested spiritual distress, rather than the confident faith that had once characterized her religious life. The content of these prayers, when they could be overheard, had been revealing. Instead of the formal, liturgical prayers that had been part of her daily routine, she had begun to offer personal, emotional pleas that revealed the depth of her guilt and despair. She had been heard to ask for forgiveness, to plead for peace, to beg for understanding of matters that she could not bring herself to name explicitly. The theological implications the Queen's apparent spiritual crisis had created significant theological problems for the religious establishment. If the Queen was indeed suffering from spiritual distress, what did this mean for the Church of England, which she headed? If God's representative on earth was experiencing a crisis of faith, what did this suggest about the divine approval of her reign? These questions had no easy answers, and the religious authorities who might have provided guidance had been constrained by the same political considerations that limited her medical treatment. They could not acknowledge that the Queen might be experiencing spiritual problems without calling into question the entire theological foundation of royal authority. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been responsible for the spiritual welfare of the realm, had found himself in an impossible position. He could not provide effective pastoral care to the Queen without acknowledging that she was experiencing the kind of spiritual crisis that might afflict any ordinary person. But to acknowledge such a crisis would have been to undermine the doctrine of divine right that was essential to royal authority. The court's response to crisis, the reaction of the court to Elizabeth's deteriorating condition, had been complex and multifaceted. On one level, there had been genuine concern for the Queen's welfare. Many of the courtiers had served her for decades and had developed real affection for her as a person, beyond their formal loyalty to the crown. On another level, there had been growing anxiety about the practical implications of her condition. The court was not merely a social institution, but the center of political power in England. The Queen's withdrawal from active participation in government had created a power vacuum that someone would have to fill. But there was no clear mechanism for determining who should assume these responsibilities. Robert Cecil, who had inherited his father's role as the Queen's principal advisor, had found himself in the extraordinarily difficult position of having to maintain the fiction of royal authority while making increasingly important decisions without the Queen's input. He had been forced to sign documents in the Queen's name, to conduct diplomatic negotiations on her behalf, and to make policy decisions that would normally have required her personal approval. This situation had been unprecedented in English history and had created constitutional problems that had no clear solutions. The entire system of government had been designed to function under the direct authority of the monarch. Without that authority, the legitimacy of governmental actions became questionable. The economic implications, the uncertainty surrounding the Queen's condition, had also begun to have economic consequences. The stability that had characterized England during most of Elizabeth's reign had been based partly on the predictability of royal policy and the consistency of governmental decision-making. Merchants, investors, and trading partners had been able to make long-term plans based on their confidence in the Queen's ability to maintain stable policies. Now, however, that confidence had been shaken. The uncertainty surrounding the succession, combined with the Queen's apparent inability to provide effective leadership, had created an atmosphere of anxiety that was beginning to affect economic activity. Trade relationships that had been carefully cultivated over decades were being called into question as foreign partners wondered about the continuity of English policy. The complex system of royal monopolies and trading privileges that had been established during Elizabeth's reign was also being affected by the uncertainty. These arrangements had been based on the Queen's personal authority and had required her ongoing approval to maintain their legitimacy. With the Queen effectively absent from the decision-making process, the legal status of these arrangements had become unclear. Their international dimension, the implications of Elizabeth's condition, had extended far beyond England's borders. The balance of power in Europe had been carefully maintained during her reign through a complex system of alliances, rivalries, and diplomatic negotiations. The Queen's personal involvement in these relationships had been crucial to their success. Now, however, foreign courts were beginning to question England's reliability as an ally and its stability as a nation. The reports being sent by foreign ambassadors had painted a picture of a kingdom in crisis, led by a monarch who was no longer capable of effective rule. Spain, in particular, had been watching the situation with keen interest. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had been a major setback for Spanish ambitions, but the Spanish court had never abandoned its hopes of eventually bringing England back under Catholic influence. The current crisis had raised the possibility that Spanish intervention might be both feasible and successful. France, too, had been monitoring the situation closely. The complex web of alliances and rivalries that had characterized European politics during Elizabeth's reign might be completely disrupted by her death and the accession of a new monarch with different policies and priorities. The deepening crisis. Elizabeth's condition continued to deteriorate. The crisis facing England had deepened. The kingdom that had been one of the most stable and prosperous in Europe was now facing the prospect of a succession crisis that might lead to civil war. The religious tensions that had been held in check during Elizabeth's reign were beginning to resurface as different factions positioned themselves for the coming struggle. The military implications of the crisis were also becoming apparent. England's armed forces had been loyal to Elizabeth personally, but their allegiance to a new monarch was uncertain. The various military commanders who had served the Queen faithfully might not be willing to transfer their loyalty to a successor whose legitimacy was questionable. The social implications were equally serious. The elaborate system of ranks and privileges that had characterized Elizabethan society had been based on the Queen's personal authority. Without that authority, the entire social order might collapse, leading to chaos and violence. The approaching end as the winter of 1603 wore on, it became increasingly clear that Elizabeth's reign was approaching its end. The Queen, who had once seemed immortal, was now obviously mortal, and the kingdom that had prospered under her rule was facing an uncertain future. The transformation of Elizabeth from the confident, commanding monarch of her prime to the frail, withdrawn figure of her final days had been tragic to witness. The woman who had once been the center of a brilliant court, who had inspired poets and artists, who had been celebrated throughout Europe for her intellect and political skill, was now a shadow of her former self. But even in her decline,